What would you do if you found yourself caught in a situation where the person you loved most in the world was brutally attacked and the person responsible had no understanding of the pain they were inflicting? Now imagine this. The person you are desperately trying to protect, the one who needs you more than anyone else, cannot even see the danger approaching. Your daughter, a blind young girl, is standing helpless in front of someone who's about to unleash violence upon her. A woman, a complete stranger to you, walks up with nothing but hatred in her eyes. And worse, she doesn't even know who you are. She doesn't know what you've been through, the sacrifices you've made, the battles you've fought just to keep your family safe and whole. But now, in one swift and horrific act, she's about to destroy everything. It sounds like something from a movie, doesn't it? Something impossible to fathom. Something so unimaginable that it seems like it could never actually happen. But this is not a movie, and it's not a work of fiction. This is the reality of what unfolded one fateful day when a quiet, peaceful neighborhood was rocked by an unimaginable act of cruelty. It's the story of how a simple, everyday interaction turned into a nightmare that forever changed the lives of everyone involved. And at the heart of it all was a woman, a mother, who was willing to do anything to protect her daughter, no matter what the cost. The question that hangs in the air is, how far would you go to protect someone you love when the world seems determined to tear you apart? The truth is, the world isn't always kind. People can be cruel, heartless, and unforgiving. And sometimes, the people who are supposed to be the ones you can trust, the ones who are meant to offer help and support, can be the very ones who turn on you without warning. When the rules of the world seem to bend in favor of those who do harm, you find yourself asking, what is justice? How do you fight back when the odds are stacked against you? Can you even trust the system to have your back when it's so easily manipulated? But there's something else at play here. Something deeper, something darker. This story isn't just about a woman defending her blind daughter from an unprovoked attack. It's about the lengths she's forced to go to when she discovers that her past, something she thought was long buried, is catching up with her in the most unexpected way. It's about discovering that your life, your very identity, is a tangled web of secrets, lies, and betrayals that threaten to consume everything you hold dear. And it's about facing a terrifying truth. Sometimes, the ones who threaten you the most are the ones who are closest to you. This is a tale of survival, of protecting what matters most when every decision you make could have life-altering consequences. The moments leading up to the attack on her daughter aren't just about physical violence. They're about the emotional and psychological toll it takes to confront something so horrifying. It's the desperate fight for justice and revenge, and the realization that the lines between right and wrong blur when you're backed into a corner with no way out. As you follow this journey, you'll uncover not just the story of one woman's battle against an unpredictable and violent world, but also a deeper exploration into the human condition, what it means to be tested beyond your limits, and what happens when everything you've built comes crashing down. You'll discover what happens when the woman you are facing isn't just an adversary, but someone who unknowingly holds the key to a much darker, far-reaching truth. And let's not forget the emotional core of this story, the bond between a mother and her child. It's the unbreakable strength that holds them together, even in the face of unspeakable odds. It's about the lengths a mother will go to, the sacrifices she'll make, the battles she'll fight, just to keep her child safe. And in this case, that fight is against a woman who has no idea what she's really up against. This story is just the beginning. It's a powerful, intense journey into the heart of human resilience, betrayal, and survival. You won't be able to look away. But before we go any further, make sure to hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, this is a story you won't forget. At the center of this story is a woman, a mother who has spent her entire life protecting those she loves. She is a force to be reckoned with, even though on the outside, she might seem just like anyone else in the neighborhood. A mother, a wife, a woman who has lived through her share of struggles and triumphs, yet remains fiercely committed to her family above all else. But there's more to her than what meets the eye. She's not just an ordinary woman living an ordinary life. She's someone with a past that she worked hard to bury, to move on from, but one that is about to resurface in the most unexpected and violent way. She lives in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, the kind of place where neighbors wave to one another as they take their morning walks, where everyone knows everyone's name, and life seems calm and uneventful. It's the kind of neighborhood where you can walk your dog in peace and know that, for the most part, you're safe. But behind this facade of tranquility, there's always a hidden current of tension. People like to pretend that everything is perfect, but the truth is, no one really knows what goes on behind closed doors. And in this community, there's one neighbor who stands out, a woman who wields her power as if she's the undisputed ruler of the block. She's known for her unapproachable demeanor, her judgmental attitude, and her sense of superiority. Karen, as everyone calls her, has always been a figure who's managed to control the people around her. Whether it's dictating the neighborhood's rules or making others feel small, she's always managed to keep her power intact, enforcing her own version of order with an iron fist. But while Karen has spent her life making sure that everyone around her is following her rules, she has no idea that there's one woman in the neighborhood who doesn't care about those rules, not one bit. That woman is the protagonist of this story, the mother who will stop at nothing to protect her daughter, even if it means going up against a force like Karen. She's not intimidated by the judgmental woman who has lived her life throwing her weight around. In fact, she spent so much of her life fighting for the ones she loves that a woman like Karen is the least of her worries. And then there's the daughter, the blind girl who has no idea what awaits her. To the world, she might seem like just another teenager trying to navigate the complexities of life, school, and relationships. But to her mother, she is everything. The bond between mother and daughter is stronger than anything, and no matter what happens, the mother will do whatever it takes to protect her child. The daughter, despite her blindness, is a symbol of hope, strength, and resilience. She represents everything good in the world, and her mother will move mountains to keep her safe. The story begins on what seems like an ordinary day, but nothing is ordinary when it comes to the lengths a mother will go to for her child. The daughter steps out, eager to begin her first day of high school, a milestone that any young person would look forward to. She's filled with excitement and anticipation, ready to face the world, unaware of the dark turn her life is about to take. Her mother, the protagonist, watches her with a sense of pride and worry. She's proud of the young woman her daughter is becoming, but she can't help but worry about the dangers that lurk just outside their door. This is where the true story begins, the collision of two worlds. On one side, you have a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her child, and on the other, you have a woman who thinks she knows best, who has spent her life judging others and imposing her will on everyone around her. Karen, with her entitled mindset, sees the world in a way that no one else does, and she is about to make a fatal mistake, one that will change the course of their lives forever. The mother's past, which she had worked so hard to keep hidden, is about to catch up with her in a way she could never have predicted. A past filled with secrets, trauma, and a world of danger that she never wanted her daughter to be exposed to. But now, all of that is coming to the surface. The calm, quiet life they've built is about to come crashing down, and nothing will ever be the same again. As the tension builds, we begin to see the contrast between the two women. The mother, who has been through hell and back, and the neighbor who thinks her actions are justified, who feels she has the right to impose her will on everyone else. The stage is set for a confrontation that will not only change the lives of these two women, but will also reveal hidden truths, spark a fight for survival, and push the limits of what it means to be a mother. What unfolds next is a test of strength, courage, and resilience. The stakes are high, and the emotions are raw. The mother will have to tap into everything she's ever learned about survival, because in this fight, it's not just her life on the line, it's her daughter's life, too. And as the story progresses, we will see just how far a mother will go when there's nothing left to lose. The calm of the neighborhood was something most people took for granted. It was the kind of place where the lawns were neatly manicured, the streets were always clean, and the sound of children laughing and playing was a common backdrop. For most, it was a picture-perfect suburban life. But for the protagonist, this piece was always a double-edged sword. beneath the surface of everyday life was a constant sense of unease, a nagging reminder that the world around her wasn't as simple as it seemed. For years, she had worked tirelessly to maintain a sense of normalcy for her daughter. The world was already a challenging place for her little girl, and every day was a test of courage and strength. Her daughter, though blind, was smart, independent, and filled with a quiet determination that constantly amazed her mother. But no matter how strong her daughter was, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. And she was right. It wasn't long before that feeling materialized in the form of Karen. Karen was a woman who had always prided herself on being the neighborhood watch, keeping tabs on every little detail that happened around the block. She wasn't officially in charge of anything, but in her own mind, she was the self-appointed enforcer of what she considered to be right and proper. The protagonist had always avoided confrontation with Karen. She didn't want to deal with the drama, didn't want to engage in petty arguments. But Karen's judgmental nature, her need to control everyone around her, began to encroach on the peace the protagonist had worked so hard to maintain. And then it all came to a head one fateful morning. It started with something small, nothing that seemed like it would ever escalate to the level of violence that would soon follow. The protagonist had allowed her daughter to pick out her own clothes for the first day of high school. It wasn't just about the outfit. It was about her daughter's independence, about showing her that she could make her own decisions, that she wasn't defined by her blindness or anyone's expectations. But Karen didn't see it that way. As the protagonist watched her daughter head out the door, there was a momentary sense of pride, mixed with the usual worry. Her daughter was starting high school, and while it should have been a moment of celebration, the protagonist couldn't shake the anxiety that always lingered when her daughter left the safety of their home. There was no telling what the outside world would throw her way. She had grown accustomed to these feelings, the constant tension between wanting to protect her child and knowing that she couldn't shelter her from everything. Karen's gaze was already fixed on her daughter as she stepped onto the sidewalk, a sense of judgment in her eyes. The protagonist noticed it immediately, the way Karen's eyes narrowed as she scanned her daughter's outfit. She knew that look, the one that spoke volumes without a single word being said. It was the look of someone who believed that her perception of the world was the only valid one. She saw her daughter's outfit not as a symbol of independence, but as an offense to the community's standards, whatever those were in her eyes. The protagonist wanted to ignore it, to let it go. But Karen had a way of pushing people into corners, forcing them to confront things they'd rather avoid. Before the protagonist could even make a move, Karen had already walked over to her daughter, starting a conversation that would quickly spiral into something much more sinister. It wasn't the first time Karen had made comments about people's appearances or choices. But this time, something about her tone was different. She was more aggressive, more confrontational, as though she believed she had the right to pass judgment on someone else's child. And as the protagonist watched from a distance, she knew this wasn't just a small, petty argument. This was something much bigger. It didn't take long for the verbal exchange to escalate. Karen, in her usual overbearing manner, began to criticize her daughter's outfit, accusing her of disrespecting the neighborhood by dressing inappropriately. The protagonist's heart raced as she saw the confusion and hurt on her daughter's face, unable to comprehend why Karen was being so cruel. The confrontation grew louder, drawing the attention of a few neighbors who stood idly by, watching the spectacle unfold. But what no one knew was that this moment of confrontation would trigger something far darker. The protagonist, sensing the danger rising, began to approach them, her heart pounding with each step. She could already feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. It was a battle for control. And it was only a matter of time before Karen's behavior took a much more dangerous turn. As the protagonist reached the scene, her instincts kicked in, telling her that she needed to defuse the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. She knew that Karen wasn't just angry, she was looking for a fight. And the protagonist, with her daughter standing there defenseless and unaware, was about to be thrust into the most terrifying confrontation of her life. It was in this moment that the protagonist's worst fear began to take shape. Everything she had worked for, the life she had built for her daughter, the peace she had tried so hard to protect, was now at risk, and the woman standing in front of her wasn't just someone who could ruin their day, she had the power to destroy everything. As the protagonist tried to intervene, the situation suddenly escalated beyond words. In an instant, Karen crossed the line, doing something so horrific that it would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The unthinkable had just become reality, and the protagonist's protective instincts would be put to the ultimate test. The calm of the neighborhood was shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. The stage was set for a battle that no one saw coming, one that would reveal not only the strength of a mother's love, but also the darkness that can hide behind a seemingly peaceful facade. The confrontation that morning had seemed like just another petty disagreement, but what transpired next would forever alter the course of their lives. At first, it felt like a blur. The words exchanged were sharp, cutting through the air like daggers, but the intensity of the moment hadn't yet sunk in. The protagonist had walked toward her daughter and Karen, trying to interject with a calm voice, but Karen wasn't listening. She never did. Her sense of superiority, her belief that she was always right, drowned out everything else. "You think you can just wear whatever you want around here?" Karen's voice was shrill, filled with contempt as she stood, towering over her daughter. "This neighborhood doesn't tolerate that kind of behavior. You'll set a bad example for the others, especially the younger kids." The protagonist's heart began to race. She could see the hurt and confusion on her daughter's face. Her daughter, who had already struggled with the world's ignorance and prejudice, was now being judged for something as trivial as her clothes. The injustice of it hit the protagonist hard. She opened her mouth to say something, to defend her daughter, but before she could speak, Karen continued, her voice growing louder. "I don't care if you're blind. You need to understand that people here have standards. You can't just walk around looking like that." It was as if the words were hitting her daughter with physical force. The protagonist could see her daughter's shoulders slump slightly, as if trying to shrink away from the verbal assault. She could feel the rage rising within her, but she kept it under control. This was not the moment to lose her composure. Her daughter needed her to stay calm, to be strong, to show that they wouldn't let someone like Karen tear them down. But Karen wasn't done. She stepped closer, invading her daughter's space, continuing her tirade without a hint of empathy or understanding. The protagonist's mind raced. She needed to step in, to put an end to this, but she couldn't let her emotions control her actions. Her daughter had already been through so much. The last thing she needed was to witness her mother getting into a fight with a neighbor. Before the protagonist could reach them, something happened, something that no one could have predicted. In the heat of the moment, Karen, her face flushed with anger, reached into her purse and pulled out something that caught the protagonist completely off guard. It was a spiked belt. The protagonist froze for a second, unsure of what she was seeing. She thought it might be a mistake, some kind of bizarre misunderstanding, but Karen didn't hesitate. With a twisted smile, Karen raised the belt and swung it toward the protagonist's daughter, aiming for her arm. It was a blur of motion, the sound of leather cutting through the air, and before anyone could react, the belt landed on the young girl's arm. The force of the blow was enough to send a shock through her entire body. The daughter stumbled back, gasping in pain, the sting of the spikes biting into her skin. The protagonist's blood ran cold. Everything around her seemed to slow down. Her daughter, her blind, vulnerable daughter, had just been attacked. It was unthinkable, yet it had happened. She couldn't believe her eyes. The woman she had once seen as just a nuisance was now a genuine threat. There was no reasoning with someone like Karen. There was no talking her down. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was an assault, and it had happened right in front of her. Instinctively, the protagonist rushed forward, grabbing her daughter and pulling her away from Karen's reach. Her heart pounded in her chest as she checked her daughter's arm, feeling the warm trickle of blood seep through her fingers. She didn't know if the attack was intentional or a momentary loss of control, but It didn't matter. The damage had been done. Karen, meanwhile, stood there, her face still twisted in anger, as if she couldn't comprehend what she had just done. The protagonist's eyes locked with hers, a mixture of disbelief and fury surging through her. "Are you out of your mind?" The protagonist spat, her voice barely contained. "How dare you hurt my daughter?" But Karen, instead of showing remorse, seemed almost defiant, as though she believed she had every right to act the way she had. Her response was chillingly cold. "She's a troublemaker," Karen said, her voice almost casual. "She needed to learn a lesson. Maybe next time she'll think twice before walking around like that." It was as if Karen had no understanding of what she had just done. She wasn't sorry. She didn't care that she had just hurt someone. She didn't care that this was a blind child who had no way of protecting herself. The protagonist felt a wave of anger, so intense it almost took over her body. She wanted to shout, to scream, to demand justice, but she couldn't. Not yet. Her daughter needed her. She needed to be calm, to be the rock that her daughter could lean on. The protagonist pulled her daughter into her arms, whispering comforting words, but her mind was already racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There was no way Karen would get away with this. The protagonist didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she was going to make sure that Karen would never, ever hurt her daughter again. But as she looked down at her daughter, still reeling from the shock of the attack, the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The calm of the neighborhood was shattered, and now there would be no turning back. The fight for justice, for the safety of her family, had just begun. What Karen didn't know was that the protagonist was no longer the same woman she had been before. Something inside her had shifted, and from that moment on, she would do whatever it took to protect her daughter, no matter the cost. The sharp sting of betrayal hung in the air like a thick fog. The protagonist's mind was clouded with a rush of conflicting emotions, anger, disbelief, and a quiet, simmering fear. She had never imagined that something like this would happen in her peaceful neighborhood, especially not from someone like Karen, who prided herself on her sense of control and authority. But now, the reality was undeniable. Her daughter had been attacked, and it wasn't just an accident or a moment of heated words. It was an intentional act of violence. As the protagonist stood there, holding her daughter close, her body shaking with both rage and a sense of helplessness, she could feel her life beginning to fracture. Karen hadn't just physically hurt her daughter, she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What had been a disagreement about something as trivial as an outfit had turned into an assault. The protagonist had always known that she would protect her daughter at any cost, but now the stakes were even higher. This wasn't just about defending her child from words or hurtful stares. This was a fight for survival. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Karen had struck first, but the attack felt far from over. The protagonist knew that people like Karen didn't back down easily. They didn't apologize or regret their actions. They thrived on power, on making others feel small and helpless. And for the first time in years, the protagonist realized that the woman she had tried to avoid, the woman who had always seemed like nothing more than a nuisance, was capable of much worse. As she cradled her daughter, trying to comfort her and wipe away the blood on her arm, the reality of the situation hit her. Karen wasn't just some angry neighbor. She was a threat, one that had the potential to destroy everything the protagonist had worked so hard to build. But more than that, Karen had attacked a child. Her daughter, the one person the protagonist loved more than anything, was the victim. And that was something that would never be forgotten. The protagonist's thoughts began to turn inward. She thought about everything she had hidden, everything she had kept buried deep down, her past, her skills, her knowledge. It had all been so carefully concealed, tucked away in the dark corners of her life. But now it felt as if that past was about to come crashing down, pulling her into a world she had long since escaped. The calm, suburban life she had so carefully curated was starting to slip through her fingers, and it terrified her. But beneath that fear was a surge of something else, something primal. She had been pushed into a corner, and when you push someone far enough, they fight back. The moment the attack happened, the protagonist's instincts kicked in. She could feel the protective warrior inside her awakening. It wasn't just about defending her daughter physically, it was about preparing for what came next. Karen hadn't just crossed a physical line, she had crossed an emotional one. And in doing so, she had unknowingly triggered something far more dangerous than she could have ever anticipated. But there was no time to waste. The protagonist could already hear the murmurs of the neighbors who had witnessed the scene. Some were calling for help, others were staring, unsure of what to do. But what they didn't understand was that this wasn't something that could be fixed with a quick apology or a simple intervention. This was something far deeper, something that would require strength, strategy, and a resolve that went beyond anything the protagonist had ever known. She helped her daughter inside, careful to keep her calm despite the growing anxiety building in her chest. There was a part of her that wanted to turn back, to pretend like this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But another part of her knew better. She couldn't ignore what had just happened. It wasn't just about the attack, it was about the bigger picture, the hidden forces at play. Karen wasn't just an isolated threat. She was a symptom of something much more dangerous, something that had been festering for far too long. As the protagonist sat with her daughter, nursing her wounds and comforting her, the weight of the situation became more and more apparent. She couldn't simply wait for the authorities to step in, for Karen to be punished by some external force. This wasn't a situation where justice would simply fall into place. If anything, Karen would likely walk away with little more than a slap on the wrist, while the protagonist and her daughter would be left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. That thought stirred something deep within the protagonist. She couldn't stand by and let Karen get away with it. She couldn't allow this to be another moment where they were the victims, left to deal with the aftermath while the world carried on as if nothing had happened. No, this time would be different. She turned to her daughter, her voice soft but firm. "We're not going to let her get away with this," she whispered, her words filled with determination. "This isn't over." Her daughter looked up at her, the fear still in her eyes, but also a flicker of trust. The protagonist knew that no matter how much her daughter had suffered, she was still strong. She had to be. They both had to be. But as the protagonist looked out the window, her mind wandered back to her past. Her own history, the skills she had once used, the knowledge she had acquired. Was it time to bring that all back to the surface? She had left it behind for a reason, but now it seemed like the only way forward. There were things she had learned, experiences she had survived, that would give her the upper hand in this battle. And it was time to fight back. Not just for her daughter, but for herself, for the life they both deserved. The protagonist stood tall, a resolve settling over her like armor. This was just the beginning, and Karen had no idea what she had just unleashed. The days that followed the attack were filled with a mixture of confusion, anger, and a growing sense of urgency. The protagonist, despite her attempts to maintain a sense of normalcy for her daughter, knew that things had irrevocably changed. The quiet suburban neighborhood she had once considered a safe haven had been shattered, and now the pieces were scattered in the form of unresolved tension and unspoken threats. Karen had shown her true colors, and the protagonist knew that, just as she had feared, this was only the beginning. But there was more than just the attack itself that weighed on her mind. The protagonist found herself haunted by the chilling reality that Karen was not going to back down easily. She wasn't the kind of person who would be satisfied with a simple apology or a quiet reprimand. Karen's twisted sense of entitlement and control had been in place for far too long, and she had already begun to rally the support of other neighbors who either stood in awe of her dominance or were too afraid to speak out. The protagonist could already feel the walls closing in. With every passing day, the neighborhood seemed to become more divided. Some of the neighbors began to distance themselves, unsure of which side to take. Others, like the protagonist, stood firm in their refusal to allow such behavior to go unchallenged. The protagonist knew that her daughter, still processing the trauma of the attack, needed time to heal, but she also understood that if she didn't act fast, the situation would escalate beyond her control. Karen was not the kind of woman who would let this go. She wasn't done yet. The protagonist spent every waking moment strategizing, not only for her daughter's physical recovery, but for what lay ahead. It wasn't just about defending her daughter's dignity anymore. It was about protecting everything they had worked so hard to build, their safety, their peace of mind, and their sense of stability. She could no longer afford to wait for the authorities to step in. She couldn't rely on the justice system to deliver the kind of punishment that Karen deserved. No, the protagonist knew that she would have to take matters into her own hands. Her mind turned back to her own past, to the experiences she had buried for so many years. She had once been part of a world that had required toughness and grit. She had learned how to survive, how to fight back, and how to navigate situations far more dangerous than this. But she had left that life behind, or so she thought. Now, it seemed that the skills and knowledge she had tried to forget were the very things that would allow her to protect her daughter and take control of the situation. She needed information on Karen, on the people who might be willing to back her up, on the hidden networks of influence that existed within the neighborhood. The protagonist began to quietly observe, learning about the people around her, gathering details that she could use. She wasn't going to let Karen manipulate her or her daughter any longer. And she wasn't going to let Karen's army of supporters turn her life into a living nightmare. The time for passivity was over. The protagonist had made up her mind. She would fight back, and she would fight hard. Meanwhile, her daughter, though physically healing, was still struggling with the emotional trauma of the attack. The protagonist could see the pain in her eyes, the lingering fear that haunted her every step. The young girl who had once been so confident and independent now seemed to shrink in on herself. She had always been brave, facing a world that was often indifferent to her blindness with a strength beyond her years. But now, she was questioning whether the world was still a place where she could feel safe. Every day, the protagonist tried to reassure her, trying to provide comfort even when her own heart was breaking. "We're going to get through this," she would tell her, holding her close. "No one can hurt you anymore. You're safe here with me." But deep down, the protagonist knew that words weren't enough. She had to show her daughter and the world that they were stronger than Karen and anyone who supported her. It wasn't just Karen's physical threat that the protagonist had to worry about, it was the psychological toll that Karen had begun to exert on the entire neighborhood. As Karen's supporters rallied behind her, the protagonist found herself increasingly isolated. People who once smiled and waved at her now avoided her gaze, their faces filled with doubt or fear. No one wanted to get involved. The protagonist was, in their eyes, the one causing trouble, the one making waves. In their minds, she had become the enemy, while Karen had twisted herself into the role of the wrong party. But the protagonist wasn't about to let that stop her. She knew that the only way to reclaim her life, to protect her daughter, and to ensure that Karen never hurt anyone again was to fight back. She started taking action, quietly making moves behind the scenes. She gathered information, spoke to neighbors who had been pushed into silence, and reached out to people who might understand the gravity of the situation. She began making connections, creating alliances with those who could help her. Those who had been too afraid to speak out before, but were now starting to see Karen for who she really was. The protagonist began to formulate a plan, one that would expose Karen's actions for what they truly were: a dangerous, manipulative attempt to control and harm others. She wasn't going to just fight Karen in the open. She was going to use Karen's own tactics against her, slowly and strategically stripping away the support Karen had garnered. The protagonist knew that it wasn't enough to simply react to Karen's actions. She needed to take the initiative and turn the tables. But there was something else on the protagonist's mind. Her past, the skills, the instincts, the resilience she had developed from her previous life were now more valuable than ever. The protagonist was no longer just a mother trying to protect her child. She was a force to be reckoned with, and she would use every resource at her disposal to ensure that Karen paid for what she had done. As the tension continued to rise, the protagonist found herself looking at Karen through a new lens. She no longer saw Karen as the neighborhood nuisance she had once been. No, Now Karen was something more dangerous, a threat that had to be neutralized, and the protagonist was willing to do whatever it took to ensure her daughter's safety and reclaim the life they had once known. Every move the protagonist made brought her one step closer to exposing Karen's true nature, but the journey ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. Karen wouldn't go down easily, and the battle for justice had only just begun. The protagonist was ready to take the fight to Karen, ready to protect her daughter, and ready to ensure that no one ever had to live in fear of a bully like Karen again. The day Karen had been avoiding was finally here, the moment when the truth about her actions would be laid bare for everyone to see. For weeks, the protagonist had quietly maneuvered, gathering evidence, reaching out to the neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out, and carefully crafting a plan that would expose Karen for what she truly was: a bully, a manipulator, and a violent woman hiding behind a mask of control and authority. The time for playing nice was over. The protagonist knew that if she wanted her daughter to feel safe again, if she wanted her family to reclaim their peace, Karen needed to be held accountable. The protagonist had made sure that all the pieces were in place. She'd gathered testimonies from neighbors who had seen Karen's past outbursts, who had witnessed her tyrannical behavior firsthand, but had been too scared to speak up. She had tracked down every scrap of evidence that could prove Karen's cruelty, the systematic way she had harassed people, bullied others into submission, and even taken matters into her own hands when it suited her. The protagonist had also reached out to local authorities, providing them with enough evidence to start an official investigation into Karen's violent behavior. But she wasn't waiting around for them to act. She couldn't. It was time for the confrontation. The protagonist stood in her front yard, her daughter by her side, ready to face the woman who had inflicted so much pain on them. She had made sure that this would be a public spectacle, no more hiding in the shadows, no more letting Karen control the narrative. It was time for Karen to face the consequences of her actions. Karen, of course, didn't know any of this. She still saw herself as the queen of the neighborhood, unchallenged and untouchable. The protagonist could almost hear Karen's arrogant voice in her head, the way she had sneered, belittled, and manipulated everyone who crossed her path. But today, everything would change. As Karen approached, the protagonist felt the rush of adrenaline surge through her body. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. The confrontation, she knew, was inevitable. But this time, she wasn't the helpless victim. She was in control, and Karen was about to realize that she had underestimated the woman standing in front of her. "Karen," the protagonist called out, her voice steady but filled with authority. Karen froze, her eyes narrowing as she saw the protagonist standing there, her daughter at her side. She had no idea what was coming. "What is it now?" Karen asked, a sneer creeping onto her face. Still playing the victim, I see. The protagonist didn't flinch. She had heard Karen's cruel words enough to know that nothing Karen said could hurt her anymore. "You're going to regret this," she said calmly. "All of it." Karen looked at her as if she were joking, but the protagonist wasn't playing. She wasn't trying to provoke or intimidate, she was simply making it clear that the game had changed. She had the upper hand now, and there was no going back. "We're going to the police," the protagonist continued. "I have evidence of what you did. The attack on my daughter was only the beginning, wasn't it, Karen? You've hurt others too, haven't you? Your reign of terror ends today." The color drained from Karen's face. For the first time, the arrogant mask began to slip, revealing the fear that had been lurking just beneath the surface. She had no idea how the protagonist had gotten so much information, how she had turned the tables so quickly, but it was too late for her to escape now. "I don't know what you think you have on me, but you don't know what you're doing," Karen spat, but there was a tremor in her voice that betrayed her confidence. The protagonist stepped forward, her posture unwavering. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. You may think you can bully your way through life, but you picked the wrong family this time. You're not going to get away with it anymore. You're going to be held accountable for everything you've done." With that, the protagonist turned and gestured for her daughter to follow her into the house. Karen stood frozen in place, her mind racing, trying to figure out how she could salvage the situation. But the protagonist wasn't done yet. As she reached the door, she turned back one last time to look at Karen. "You'll never hurt anyone again, Karen. Not in this neighborhood, not anywhere." There was no dramatic exit, no final shouting match. It wasn't necessary. The protagonist had said everything she needed to say. She had taken control, and now it was time for the authorities to handle the rest. As she closed the door behind her, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The battle was far from over, but the first step had been taken. Karen had been exposed, and the community could no longer ignore the truth. There was a long road ahead, but the protagonist was ready for it. In the days that followed, the protagonist found herself at the center of a whirlwind of emotions. There were moments of triumph when she saw the first signs of support from neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out. There were moments of doubt when she questioned if she had done enough, if the justice system would follow through with the consequences Karen deserved. And there were moments of deep, overwhelming love for her daughter, whose healing process was still underway, both physically and emotionally. The protagonist never stopped fighting for her daughter. She pushed through every challenge, every setback, always reminding herself of the bigger picture. Her daughter's safety, their peace of mind, and the sense of justice that they both so desperately needed. Through it all, she realized something fundamental. She wasn't just protecting her daughter, she was protecting herself. She had been forced into a position where she had to confront her fears, her past, and her deepest vulnerabilities. And in doing so, she had become something she never thought she could be: a woman who refused to let anyone control her life, a woman who would stand up to any threat no matter how powerful. The journey wasn't easy. There were still battles to fight, both legal and personal. But the protagonist had learned a valuable lesson. She was stronger than she had ever realized. And no matter how many obstacles Karen or anyone else threw in her way, she would continue to fight. For her daughter, for herself, and for the peace that she and her family had once taken for granted. As the story came to a close, the protagonist stood tall, looking out into the horizon. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready. Ready to face whatever came next, with the unshakable knowledge that no matter the darkness, she had the strength to overcome it. And with that, she turned her back on the past, facing a future that would be brighter, stronger, and free from the shadows of fear. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where justice, courage, and love would always lead the way. The days following the final confrontation felt like a blur of emotions, relief, anxiety, and even disbelief. The protagonist had fought for her daughter, fought for justice, and in many ways had fought for herself. It wasn't just about protecting her family anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and facing down the ghosts of her past. But as she looked around at the quiet streets of her neighborhood, she felt a sense of bittersweet accomplishment. The world hadn't changed overnight, but she had, and that transformation, while small in the grand scheme of things, was everything. For the first time in weeks, the protagonist found herself able to breathe. The tension that had once gripped her heart, tight and suffocating, was beginning to loosen. It wasn't that the battle was over. No, there were still legal battles to fight, still people to convince, still damage to repair. But it was different now. She wasn't fighting this fight alone anymore. She had her daughter by her side, and in her own way, her daughter had found strength too. The scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal, but they would heal. And they would heal stronger than ever. As for Karen, the consequences of her actions were beginning to catch up with her. The community had rallied behind the protagonist, slowly turning against Karen as more of her manipulative tactics came to light. It wasn't just about the attack on the protagonist's daughter anymore. It was about the way Karen had long exerted control over everyone around her, using her power and influence to bully, intimidate, and tear people down. The neighborhood that had once been silent had begun to find its voice. And for once, Karen's hold over them seemed to be slipping away. But for the protagonist, the focus was always on her daughter. Watching her grow stronger each day, hearing her laugh again, Seeing her regain the confidence she had once lost, it was the most beautiful gift the protagonist could have asked for. The journey had been painful, but it had also been a profound reminder of the strength they both possessed. The protagonist realized that the love she had for her daughter was the foundation that would see them through every storm. And no matter what came next, she would always fight for that love. In the weeks that followed, the protagonist and her daughter began to rebuild their lives, not just physically, but emotionally. They had learned the hard way that the world could be cruel, that people could hurt others without remorse, but they had also learned that they were resilient. The strength they had within themselves was something no one, especially not Karen, could take away. They began to move forward, one step at a time. The protagonist took small moments to reflect on the journey, on the lessons learned, on the courage it had taken to face their fears and push through the hardest times. There was a quiet sense of peace now, one that hadn't existed before. It wasn't a perfect peace. Life was never perfect, but it was theirs. It was a peace earned through sacrifice, determination, and love. The protagonist often found herself thinking back to the day when Karen had swung that belt at her daughter. It was a moment she would never forget, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But now, as she looked at her daughter, safe and healed, she realized that in some strange way, that moment had also been the catalyst for change. It had forced her to confront everything she had been running from: the fear, the uncertainty, the past she had worked so hard to forget. And in doing so, it had brought her closer to her daughter and to herself. The neighborhood was quieter now, the air lighter, but the protagonist knew that she would never be the same. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the fight for justice wasn't just about confronting the people who wronged you. It was about confronting your own fears, your own demons, and finding the strength to stand up, not just for yourself, but for those you love. And so the story came to an end, not with fireworks or dramatic speeches, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that against all odds, they had come through stronger. The protagonist didn't need to be the most powerful person in the world. She just needed to be strong enough to protect what mattered most. And in that, she had already won. As she and her daughter sat together, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, the protagonist knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, united, unbroken, and unafraid. The fight was over, but their journey was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, the protagonist could look ahead with hope, knowing that nothing and no one could ever take away the love they had for each other.